Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is going to be me talking about all of my favorite books that I read in 2024. This one was a very hard list to put together. I always really overthink my top 10 favorites, so I am going to talk about my top 10 favorites. I do also have a couple of honorable mentions because it just didn't feel right to not mention some of those books, but they didn't really make it into the top 10, but they were so close. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and talk about them. This year I read about 160 books. That's pretty much been my average for the past couple of years. As I was putting together this list of my favorites and honorable mentions, I did notice this year felt very much like an inverse bell curve because the beginning of my year was really strong, the ending of my year was really strong. The middle, we're not really going to see a lot of books that are in this list that I read in the middle of the year, but that's okay. In previous years, I feel like my list has been split pretty much 50-50 between fantasy and horror. This year's list is a pretty horror-centric list, and I did have a pretty horror-centric year as well, so that all checks out. So just briefly going through the honorable mentions, the first one I want to talk about is Antenora by Dori Lumpkin. This is a very small novella that I just want to give a shout out to because it does not have a lot of ratings on Goodreads. I thought this was a perfectly paced novella. It is religious horror, it is culty horror, it's also sapphic. It's told in one of my favorite storytelling styles where the main character is sitting down and talking to you, the reader, and telling you a story. I thought that worked really well for this novella. Another novella slash shorter book that is going to be on my honorable mentions is Victorian Psycho. This is by Virginia Feito, and this one I actually read as a NetGalley e-arc. So this one does not come out until February, so I urge everyone to pick this up, not only because this is a very fun slasher, but it's also already getting a movie adaptation, and just based on my experience reading this book, I think it's going to be such a fun, wonderful horror movie. Like, I feel like it's going to have the vibes of like a Bodies, Bodies, Bodies or something like that, because it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's a fun premise, and it's a whole lot of bloody fun. So this one is essentially Jane Eyre meets American Psycho, about a governess who goes to watch over these children. Very tongue-in-cheek horror that worked really well for me. Another book that I really enjoyed is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. This is an absolutely stunning debut. I enjoyed the commentary that this had about the Asian American kind of immigrant, but especially Asian American woman experience, having to deal with internal pressures, external pressures, and of course racism, both put upon our main character, and then the internal racism that she kind of has to deal with herself. This is disturbing body horror, and I just had a lot of fun with this one. This is social commentary horror that worked really well for me. The balance between the social commentary horror and the body horror was top tier in this book. Another honorable mention that I have is Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. This book I was very pleasantly surprised by because I had not enjoyed books by Chuck Tingle in the past, but this one really worked for me. This is another one that combines humor and horror really well, and I enjoyed those aspects. I enjoyed the social commentary, in particular about AI and the way that AI is destroying art. And if you have any emotional attachment, which I feel like we all do, to any sort of art form, whether that be movie, music, TV, books, you should be against AI, and you should want AI to not be in any sort of artistic space at all and have it be regulated. And the social commentary that was in this one is so important. It's so timely, so I would urge people to pick that up for those aspects alone. You know, maybe gift it to someone who thinks that AI has a place in art, because it absolutely does not, and this book perfectly illustrates that. And then my last honorable mention, this is one that I really went back and forth with putting it on my top 10. So even though it is on my honorable mentions list, this is definitely book 11, and that would be me, I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. This is my favorite Stephen Graham Jones book. I feel like in another year, this definitely would have made it on the top 10. I also have kind of like an anti-recency bias for this book because I did read this book the last 2 days of the year. So I didn't have as much time to sit with this one as I did some of the other ones on this list. So, you know, maybe I'll look back next year and feel like this has moved up a couple of slots. That would not surprise me, but I really, really love this one. If you love slashers, if you love books set in the 80s, if you love Stephen Graham Jones's writing style, this is a must read. I really, really loved this one and definitely almost made my top 10. I just had a lot of fun with this one. The physical book, the audio book, both are great experiences, and this was another one where the main character is directly talking to you, the reader, the whole time, and that is just a writing style that I really love. So really enjoyed this one, and my honorable mentions, all great books, but I did have to narrow my list down, so they were still great books. Let's move on to my top 10 of the year. Now, my top 10 books of the year are not in any particular order except for my last two. I overthink this list so much every year, so it just would be too much to try and put them in any sort of order. So these are my top 10 of the year. No specific order, just the top 10 books that I read this year. And number 10 would be You Like It Darker by Stephen King. These 12 stories are about fate, mortality, luck, and the folds in reality where anything can happen. This is a collection of 12 short stories that delve into the darker parts of life, both metaphorical and literal. This is such a solid short story collection. The reason why this made it to my top 10 favorites is because of two short stories specifically, and that would be number 1, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, and number 2, The Answer Man. These two short stories elevated this to be my favorite Stephen King short story collection and my favorite short story collection overall. Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream is just quintessential King, a quintessential King story, a cat and mouse sort of story, a detective story with paranormal elements, and I just thought it was absolutely wonderful. And then The Answer Man was so beautiful, and it really encapsulates the other thing that I love about Stephen King, because he's the master of horror, but he's the master of writing about the beauty in the everyday, and just following this man that is any man, could be any one of us, and following throughout his lifetime as he interacts with this Answer Man. Just the ending, it was a beautiful conclusion to this story collection, and just a beautiful conclusion just in that short story as well. I teared up about it. It really is a great introduction to Stephen King, and even though I just mentioned those two short stories, I don't think there's a single short story in here that I don't like. There's no short stories in this collection that are duds. They're all great in various levels. Obviously, you have your favorites and you have some that you don't vibe with as much, but there's nothing in here that wasn't a strong, cohesive story. So I really enjoyed this short story collection. Book number 9 is Black River Orchard by Chuck Wendig. In Black River Orchard, a small town is transformed by dark magic when 7 strange trees begin bearing magical apples. When the townsfolk discover the secret of the orchard, everyone is consumed by an obsession with the magic of the apples. And what's the harm if it's making them happier, more confident, and more powerful? However, something else is buried in the orchard besides the seeds of these extraordinary trees, a bloody history whose roots reach back to the very origins of the town. So I discovered Chuck Wendig this year. I read Black River Orchard in January, and then I went on to read the Book of Accidents later on in the year and fell in love with this author. I would very hesitantly say that if you love Stephen King, you're going to love Chuck Wendig as well. They share a lot of similarities, at least in the 2 books from Chuck Wendig that I have read so far. In particular, speaking about Black River Orchard, this one just has a lot of things that I love in horror. We're following a small town, and we're not just following one protagonist, we're following pretty much the whole town, and I love that premise. I really love the character work that was in this one, and the way that this is so cemented in a place and time, just like Stephen King. I know this is a hit or miss for a lot of people. Chuck Wendig Wendig uses a lot of pop culture references in his books, so I really enjoy that in a book. I know a lot of other people don't, but I especially like then reading these books not in the year that they came out and then seeing those references and really feeling cemented in a particular time. And I really like this one. It really worked for me. I love the premise of a small town that is very idyllic at the beginning and has some secrets and maybe has something that is slowly rotting the town from within. And this also featured a group of protagonists that were very unlikely that had to come together to save their town, premises that I just love in horror. So I really enjoyed this one. This one is a very chunky book. It's, I think, about 700 pages, but this is one where that page count, it does not feel like a 700-page book. And by the end of this book, you really feel like you not only know this town, but you know these characters, and all of these things could have actually happened because the journey feels so realistic, even though it is magical. Book number 8 is Guillotine by Delilah S. Dawson. Thrift fashionista Des Lane doesn't want to date Patrick Ruskin. She just wants to meet his mother, the editor-in-chief of a premier fashion magazine. When he invites her to his family's big Easter reunion at their ancestral home, she's certain she can put up with his arrogance and fend off his advances long enough to ask Marie Caulfield Ruskin for an internship someone with her pedigree could never nab through the regular submission route. But once all of the family members are on the island and the ferry has departed, things take a dark turn. This one I'm going to pitch as The Menu meets Saw. I know a lot of people didn't actually like this one, and that actually kind of cemented this book as being in my top 10, because every time I saw someone make a negative review about this book, I understood what they were saying. I understood their critiques and the things that they didn't like about it, but it made me like love this book even more, if that makes sense. I just thought this was a very fun, very silly, very bloody time. Before this year, I never would have said that I enjoyed horror comedy, but I've really grown to love it this year. Obviously, not all of the books on my list are horror comedy. Some are more serious horrors, but this one was very fun. It was very fun and, you know, potentially maybe a little bit heavy-handed, but it is a shorter book, so like that doesn't really bother me. This set out to fulfill a certain mission, and that mission was fulfilled. I think the time that I read this was also really important. I just had the perfect reading setup for this. I read it during a 24-hour readathon, and I just had such a lovely time with this. I would highly recommend the audiobook. That's how I read it, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed our main character, Des, and I felt like this would make a really good movie, perhaps because of the comp titles of The Menu and Saw. I just feel like this would be a really fun horror comedy movie, and I thought this was a whole lot of fun. I will say, if you liked Bloom, if you loved Bloom, and you go into this one, don't expect another Bloom. This book feels very different. I like both of them, but the tones, very different. This one definitely leans more into the over-the-top gore and kind of situational satire and horror as well, but I had a lot of fun with this one. This was definitely like a let them eat cake style of horror that I really enjoyed. Book number 7 on my list is Dragon Rider by Taran Matharu. Jai lives as a royal hostage in the Sabine court. Ever since his father, the leader of the steppe folk, led a failed rebellion and was executed by the very emperor Jai now serves. When the emperor's son and heir is betrothed to a princess of a neighboring dance kingdom, she brings with her a magnificent dowry of dragons. Exclusive to the northern nation, these powerful beasts come in several forms, but mystery surrounds them. Only dance royalty know the secret to soul bonding with these dangerous beasts to draw on their power and strength. This marriage and the alliance it forms will change that forever, but conspirators lurk in the shadows, and soon the Sabine court is in chaos. With his life in danger, Jai uses the opportunity to escape with a stolen hatchling. Can an orphaned captive learn the secrets of the Dragon Riders to rise up and avenge his people? This was another book that was absolutely a right time, right book scenario. I read this around the end of the year, and I needed a fun book. I needed a fun book. I needed a cozy book. I needed a nostalgic book book without it being a reread. That's a very high bar, but I did pick up Dragon Rider and ended up really loving this one. If you've ever loved a boy and his dragon sort of story, if you loved Aragon as a child and you want an adult fiction counterpart that does not feel like fan fiction or a retelling of Aragon, but rather just, you know, uses some of those tropes that were so effective in Aragon and in fantasy in general, then I think that you would really love Dragon Rider. I'm so looking forward to the next book in this series. I really love the way that this took a lot of traditional tropes in fantasy that are traditional tropes for a reason, because they are so well loved, and kind of mixing them on their head a little bit. I'm really intrigued to see where the different political machinations are going to go in this series. I like our main character. He's a little clueless, but he's learning. His heart is in the right place, and I love the magic system. I thought that was intriguing, and I love like the dragon writing system. This book made me feel like a kid again, because I just was so invested. When I wasn't reading this book, I was thinking about what kind of dragon, or there are other magical creatures as well that you can soul bond with in this series. I was just thinking about what kind of creature I'd want to soul bond with, and just I really love a book that can stick with you and make you really crave to be in that world, or at least aspects of the world. Obviously there's a war going on in this book, so I don't know if necessarily I'd want to be thrust in the middle of it, but just the magic system and the dragon system I just found so compelling, and I absolutely ate this book up. This is one that I think it's over 500 pages, but it took me maybe a day, a little bit less if I'm just looking at the amount of hours that I spent reading this one. This was one where I was reading it physically, and then when I couldn't read physically, I was picking up the audiobook just because this is so fast-paced and fun. Book number 6 is Model Home by River Solomon. The three Maxwell siblings keep their distance from the lily-white gated enclave outside Dallas where they grew up. When their family moved there, they were the only Black family in the neighborhood. The neighbors acted nice enough, but right away, bad, scary, strange, and unexplainable things began to happen in their house. Maybe it was a cosmic trial, a demonic rite of passage into the upper middle class. Whatever it was, the Maxwells stayed put, unwilling to abandon their home, terrors and trauma be damned. As adults, the siblings could finally get away from the horrors of home, leaving their parents all alone in the house. But when news of their parents' death arrives, Ezri is forced to return to Texas with their sisters to reckon with their family's past and present. So we are definitely switching gears here. I mentioned before how much horror comedy worked for me this year. This is very much a very unsettling horror, a very horrific horror, very serious, deals with a lot of very dark topics, and uses horror as a vehicle and as a means to explore some truly dark and horrific things. If you are a Mike Flanagan fan, I want you to pick up this book. I think it's really going to work with you. The way that both Mike Flanagan and River Solomon have used a haunted house as a vehicle to explore trauma and to explore family dynamics. I think both of them do that really well. This is the only book that I feel really comfortable comparing to a Mike Flanagan adaptation, like The Haunting of Hill House. This just does it so brilliantly well. I listened to this one via audiobook, and this one really literally made me stop in my tracks. During one point at the reveal of this book, I was doing laundry. I can remember it very vividly, and I just had to stop and sit down on my bed and just listen, because this book was just so powerful and so shocking and horrific, and it was really excellently done. I would say trigger warnings galore for a whole lot of things, including suicidal ideation and just that act in general, and then also any sort of family trauma or any sort of parental abuse or abuse of a child. Very heavy themes talked about in this book, but I just thought it was so brilliantly done. This is my first River Solomon, and this is going to be a high bar to clear, but I'll definitely be reading more works from them next year, because this was just a masterpiece. This is a horror masterpiece, a grief horror masterpiece, and I can't wait to read more from the author. Book number 5 is Fragile Animals by Genevieve Jagger. When an ex-Catholic woman develops a relationship with a vampire, she is forced to confront confront the memories that haunt her religious past. Struggling to deal with the familial trauma of her Catholic upbringing, Noelle travels to the Isle of Bute. There she meets a man who claims to be a vampire, and a relationship blooms between them based solely on confession. But as talk turns sacrilegious and the weather outside grows colder, Noelle struggles to come to terms with her blasphemous sexuality. This book was such a pleasant surprise. I had never heard of it. It wasn't on my radar. I was actually on the Libby app looking to check out another book, and this was one of the recommended titles, and the cover drew me in. It's a very striking cover, and I also saw it was about vampires, so I thought, let's go ahead and give it a shot, and I was just so drawn in and just so blown away by the prose of this one. This is a debut, and I am so excited to read what this author comes out with next. I really loved the conversations in here. This is definitely for my character-driven readers. I think if you're a plot-driven reader, this may be a little too internal of a book for you, but I just loved the conversations that were had here. Our main character, Noelle, is really grappling with a lot in her life, not only her sexuality, but her religious Catholic upbringing, and then also some trauma with events that happened between her mother and a priest in the Catholic Church. And it's a lot. It's a lot for our main character. It's a lot for her to process. A very big caveat of this is a lot of the marketing about this book, at least from what I've seen on its synopsis on Libby and its synopsis on Storygraph, is that it really plays up the relationship between Noelle and the vampire and how it is like a romantic sexual relationship, and that is not the point of this story at all, I don't think. I think if you go in fact, I know if you go in expecting a delightful or even like a darker romantic vampire tale, you're going to be disappointed. That is not what this is. This also feels more like a literary fiction, magical realism vampire story as opposed to a horror vampire story, and the relationship between Noelle and the vampire is definitely an interesting one, definitely one that calls to mind a confessional. So I thought this one was just such a beautiful, interesting book and had some really great character work. Definitely, I think one of my underrated books of this year, if I'm looking at just the sheer like number of ratings and people who have read and reviewed all of these books based on apps like Storygraph. This is one of those that's flying a little bit under the radar. So if you like magical realism, vampire fiction that really dives deep into themes of religious trauma, then I think you should give this one a go. I think you'll have a really good time with it. Book number 4 is The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. Carolyn's not so different from the other people around her. She likes guacamole and cigarettes and steak. She knows how to use a phone. Clothes are a bit tricky, but everyone says nice things about her outfit with the Christmas sweater over the gold bicycle shorts. After all, she was a normal American herself once. That was a long time ago, of course, before her parents died, before she and the others were taken in by the man they called Father. Carolyn and her adopted siblings have been raised according to Father's ancient customs. They've studied the books in his library and learned some of the secrets of his power, and sometimes they've wondered if their cruel tutor might secretly be God. Now Father is missing, perhaps even dead, and the library that holds his secrets stands unguarded, and with it, control over all creation. This is such a hard book to describe. This is such a hard book to like convey the plot and everything that happens within it and all of the moving parts, and it was just so wild and wonderful. This is another one that has like a lot of comedic beats. This is, I feel like, equal parts fantasy and horror. There's some gruesome body horror in here. There's some sentimentality. There's again comedic moments, and I loved it. I had no idea what this book was going into it. I was reading it for a vlog series, and at the end, still don't really know like who I would pitch this book to. I've never read a book quite like this one. I was totally drawn in, and it was such a unique premise when you're reading the book and just uncovering all of the different little pieces that fit together and all of the different ideas and like plot structure, and I don't even want to say magic system, but like system of how things work, and the library and the different characters. This is such a behemoth and such a fascinating book, and I was very quickly figured out that this was going to become one of my favorite books of the year because I've just never read anything like it and had such a wonderful time reading it. I go to to the author's page to see if there's anything more from him that I can pick up and read. This is the only book he's ever written. The other things that he has on his Storygraph page are some Linux programming manuals, so I don't know if we're ever going to get anything more by this author, but quite honestly, if I were Scott Hawkins, I also understand why he hasn't put anything else out, because this is like a master book. This does not feel like a debut. This does not feel like someone who just wrote one book and has never written again. I totally respect that, and I'm sure the Linux manuals, if you're into that sort of thing, are excellently done as well. But just I need more. I need more from this author, and just this book, it is such a weird time. It never really knows what it is purposefully. It really evades like all sorts of categorization. It feels very horror at times. It feels culty at times. It feels very end of the world apocalypse. It feels spy thriller. Like there's a lot going on that should not all work. Like even at one point there's like talking lions. None of this should all work cohesively, but I think it does really, really well. So this was such an enjoyable, fun, weird reading experience. I don't think I'm ever going to read another book quite like it again. Book number 3 is American Rapture by C.J. Leede. A virus is spreading across America, transforming the infected and making them feral with lust. Sophie, a good Catholic girl, must survive the hellscape of the Midwest to try and save her twin brother while the world around her burns. Along the way, she discovers there are far worse fates than dying a virgin. This is probably one of the best covers of the year. I absolutely love it, and I absolutely fell in love with this story. As an ex-Catholic person who grew up in the Midwest, this book just really hit home for a lot of different ways. I typically don't love road trip stories or like zombie apocalypse stories. This is a little bit of both, and it's a testament to how great this book is that despite those, and not even despite those, I ended up really loving those elements, and I don't typically love those elements in fiction. I really enjoyed this one. This one feels very different than Mayfly, another book that I really enjoyed, but this one really has a place in my heart. This one, just the themes worked a little bit better for me. The body horror in here is intense. It's not a traditional zombie horror. This is almost like, think of like The Last of Us in terms of zombies, where there is a virus and it infects the people with lust, and do with that what you will. There's a lot of really horrific body horror, and obviously based on that synopsis, trigger warnings for there's a lot of sexual content in here. There's a lot of attempted SA scenes just because of the nature of the virus. And then of course also, like with any good zombie horror fiction, you have the hell or the real pandemic is also other people, not just the zombies. We are really exploring Sophie as she realizes from the onset of this novel she's really forced into reckoning with her previous very small-minded worldview and what she was raised believing, and maybe confronting some of that at a very breakneck speed because she has no other option than to travel across the US with some heathens, people that she wouldn't necessarily have associated with in a past life. And then we also have dangers from the zombies themselves, but also from really religious people who are perpetuating this virus because they either don't believe this virus exists or they believe that this is God's punishment, and they're actively trying to spread it throughout the United States. So it's very dark. It gets very dark. There are a lot of very horrific scenes to read. The body horror and this one is very visceral, and it's a lot. I'm a horror reader, and I think this was a very dark book, but I don't think that any of like the dark scenes and the tragic scenes are unearned. This is definitely not like gore for gore's sake or slasher scenes. Like they're all very integral to the story, and they make a lot of sense within the plot. And I just had such a wonderful time sitting with Sophie and just exploring her journey, both externally trying to find her brother and then internally as well. I thought that was really beautiful. I cried at the end of this book, and I also got very teary about the author's notes and acknowledgements as well. This is just such a beautiful piece of fiction that I think really combines social commentary horror and then like apocalyptic horror. Those are balanced really well here, and I just thought thought it was such a beautiful story, which is a weird thing to say about such a bloody apocalypse book, but this is very beautiful in a lot of ways. Book number 2 is Blood Over Bright Haven by Emma Wang. For 20 years, Sayona has devoted every waking moment to the study of magic, fueled by a mad desire to achieve the impossible, to be the first woman ever admitted to the high magistry at the University of Magics and Industry. When Sayona finally passes the exam and becomes a high mage, she finds her challenges have just begun. Her new colleagues are determined to make her feel unwelcome, and instead of a qualified lab assistant, they give her a janitor. What neither Sayona nor her peers realize is that her assistant was not always a janitor. 10 years ago, he was a nomadic hunter who lost his family on their perilous journey from the wild plains to the city. But now he sees the opportunity to understand the forces that decimated his tribe, drove him from his homeland, and keep the privileged in power. When mage and outsider work together, they uncover an ancient secret that could change the course of magic forever if it doesn't get them killed first. This book is an absolutely breathtaking fantasy standalone, just like my number 1 does for the horror genre. This really feels like everything encompassed what I love about the fantasy genre in one book. We have such interesting world building and a very interesting magic system. We have 2 main characters that are just so realistic, and even though they live in a world that is not like our own at all, it turns out, you know, as you start reading similarities, you start realizing that even though this is a fantasy world, the problems that characters are facing are very much prevalent in our world as well. Sayona is just such a wonderful main character. Both her and Tommel, they really play off each other really well. The character work in here is amazing. I love both of them so much, and their dynamics as they play off of each other, and the way that this book explores such beautiful themes. I am not the first person to say this, but I will definitely reinforce the point. If you liked Babel, definitely pick this book up, and vice versa. They are very much sister books when it comes to exploring a dark academia in a fantasy setting while exploring colonialism, imperialism, racism, and just the way in which being educated and attending university and gaining knowledge is a very privileged position to have, and that higher education as an institution still has a lot of work to do before it becomes an equitable place where everyone has an equal place at the table. We have Sayona, who is really wrestling with the inherent sexism. She's the first female mage, not because she's the first woman who is qualified to be in this position, but because society is holding women back. She suffers so much sexism at the hands of her peers. But then we also have Tommel, who does not have those problems of being a woman, but because of the color of his skin, because of his accent, because of his ethnicity, he is looked down upon. He is constantly being thought of as lower than he actually is, being assumed he doesn't have the capabilities, being assumed he's not as human as other people, and just the stereotypes, even from well-intentioned people, also are drawing him back. So it's very intersectional. It's an intersectional book, and I know I've talked a lot about the social commentary in this, but at no point in this book does it feel heavy-handed. This really weaves in those aspects and those commentary brilliantly. I think this book does a great job. It's perfectly paced. This is a standalone where I understand and respect it's a standalone. I wish it wasn't, just because I love the characters so much, but this book just really is perfectly done, and I absolutely love it. It's definitely going to be in my favorite fantasy books of all time. I know Emma Wang has another standalone fantasy that I will definitely be prioritizing picking up next year, because this is just a masterclass. When I finished this book, I was like, this is why I love fantasy. This is why fantasy is such a wonderful genre. I'm obsessed. I love the way that this book is written, and the character work, and just how everything comes together at the end. This is a beautiful work of art. And then we have my favorite book of the year for 2024, and that would be Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. Anna and Reed needed a lucky break. The horrifically complicated birth of their first child has left Anna paralyzed, bitter, and struggling with mobility, with her relationship with Reed, and with resentment for her baby. That's about to change with the words any New Yorker would love to hear: affordable housing lottery. They've won an apartment in the Deptford, one of Manhattan's most revered buildings. Reed is very dismissive of both disturbing events and Anna's deep unease and paranoia as the price of living in New York. People are just eccentric here, but even he can't explain the needle-like bite marks on the baby. This is Rosemary's Baby meets Salem's Lot. Those are two perfect horror novels for me, and this is another perfect horror novel that perfectly blends both of those, takes tropes and themes in both of those stories, perfectly modernizes it, and all of that combined make an absolutely perfect vampire story. I love this book. I think I read this in March, maybe, something like that, towards the beginning of the year, but I'm not exaggerating when I say I think about this book probably once a week since I've read it. This is a book that, like, it's why I love horror. Honestly, Nat Cassidy's entire backlog of books at this point, I have not read a book that I have not absolutely loved by him, but he just gets it. And these books just really showcase the best in what horror has to offer. Horror is unsettling. It allows us to face our fears in a very comfortable and safe way because we're just reading from them the events and not actually experiencing these events. Horror can be very cathartic, both to write, as we'll see, and if you read the author's notes and acknowledgments of this book, and it can also be cathartic to read as well. Horror allows us to grapple with injustices that happen in real life, and even though vampires are fun and they're scary and they're definitely having a resurgence, which I feel like that and the resurgence of Gothic fiction, I could go on an entire historical tangent with that, but I did really like the way that these vampires were described. This plays on a lot of Jewish mythology and folklore, and that is just something that I feel like you don't really see in vampire novels that often, or really paranormal horror in general, especially when it comes to religious aspects or religious paranormal horror. It's very, very Christian based. It's really Catholic based when it comes to exorcisms and even vampires and a lot of stuff like that. So I did really appreciate those perspectives, and this book also just had wonderful emotional beats. This is another book that the last couple of chapters I was crying the whole way through. I think this is just such a beautiful book. It's a truly terrifying book, and it's also a book that is just so beautiful, and that's a really hard balance to strike. And it's one of the things that I love about the horror genre, is that not only are you experiencing, because the monsters are cool, right? The monsters of the horror genre are fun and all of that, but also in horror books like this one, there's just a love for humanity despite its flaws. Even though dark things can and will happen in someone's life, just humanity is just so beautiful. It's so flawed. There's darkness, there's light. That's why they play so well off of each other. I could sing the praises about this book all day long. It's definitely, without a doubt, my favorite horror book and just my favorite book of 2024. If you're a vampire lover, you gotta pick this up. If you're someone who wants to pick up a horror book, I would recommend this one, although I don't know if you pick this up, I don't think a lot are going to compare to this one, because I do think it's a perfect horror book. It genuinely scared me. It made me cry. It made me feel like the whole gamut of emotions. So I cannot say enough good things about Nat Cassidy and his work. So Nestlings definitely cements itself as the #1 book that I read this year. But that is going to be the end of this video. It's a very long one. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know down below what was your favorite book of 2024. Please be sure to give this video a like, subscribe to my channel for all of the bookish, cozy gaming and horror content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!